Welcome to the Strengthening English Language Learners and Multilingual Learners, ELLs and MLs, Instruction Topic 1, titled Using Translation as a Support and Not a Solution. My name is Madeline Sanchez. We're happy to see that you have stopped by to learn about key strategies to implement during your instruction, and we hope that you find this presentation helpful. Before we get started, we want you to learn more about the group that put this presentation together. The Strengthening English Language Learner and Multilingual Learners Working Group is a subgroup of the state's ELL Leadership Council. The group includes 6 English language learner and multilingual learner educational leaders representing various regions across New York State, in addition to 1 associate of the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages. This team collaborates and works on assessing the needs that educators may have during and post-COVID-19 through remote learning experiences. To give you a little background, we can tell you that across New York State, we have the great fortune to serve over 260,000 English language learners. The New York State Education Department believes that all teachers are teachers of multilingual learners. New York State educators, just like yourself, are charged with ensuring that all students, including multilingual learners, feel safe, connected, they feel included, and that they see themselves represented in their learning environments. In addition, students need to have access to grade level content. They need to be given opportunities to meet grade level standards and experience high quality instruction, all while using all of their language repertoires in order to learn and express themselves properly. This will require that educators shift their mindset from I need to translate everything to I need to use the most valuable resource in my instruction and in my classroom, which is my students' home language. The target audience for this presentation is all educators K through 12 that work with multilingual learners. Today we're going to explore 3 instructional strategies, which will be bridging languages, using students' home language, and using cognates. These are strategies that we want educators to consider before using the last and 4th strategy, which is using translations. Please note that through this presentation, we're going to be referring to home language as L1 and target language as L2. We hope you find the information and the best practices here useful and that you're able to implement some of these during your in-person, your hybrid, or your remote instruction. The Strengthening English Language Learner and Multilingual Learners Work Group has established the following overarching goals. We hope to create practical and accessible resources for all teachers of English language learners and multilingual learners in order to not only support your instruction, but to support student learning. We want to contribute to closing the gap by strengthening L and ML instruction by focusing on the following topics, which is using translations as a support, not a solution, keeping the communication with our multilingual families alive and strong, supporting our multilingual digital learners, and finally, building the bridge from content to academic language development. For today's presentation, however, we're going to focus on topic 1, using translations as a support and not a solution. And by the end, we hope that we'll be able to help you identify useful strategies before using translating instructional resources. We hope to help you use the student's language as a tool to help develop language, engagement, and participation. We hope to help you review specific examples of how and when to use the student's home language as a resource for instruction. Bridge the gap or bridge the student's home language from their L1 to the target language L2 by incorporating some things such as cognates, and to implement translation practices that will enhance the learning of all students. So let's get started. According to Dr. Jim Cummins' 2010, there are 3 held assumptions on how to teach language that continue to dominate classroom instruction, even though these beliefs are largely unsupported by empirical evidence and inconsistent with current understanding both of how people learn and the functioning of the bilingual brain. Dr. Cummins refers to these 3 interrelated assumptions as monolingual instructional principles. And these are: instruction should be carried out exclusively in the target language without recourse to students L1, that translation between L1 and L2 has no place in the teaching of language or literacy, and that within immersion and bilingual programs, the two languages should be kept rigidly separate. Furthermore, Dr. Cummins argues that the three aforementioned principles also operate to exclude some extremely powerful opportunities for second language learning and the use in the classroom. Instead, Dr. Cummins encourages us to use bilingual instructional strategies that can promote identities of competence among language learners who are from socially marginalized groups, and thereby enabling them to engage more confidently with literacy and other academic worth in both of their languages. So it is key that the teachers of ELLs welcome all of the students' home languages for their teaching and for the students' academic growth. In the following video, you will hear Dr. James Cummins talking about the importance of bringing languages together to build awareness of how languages work. We encourage you to pause this presentation and maybe take a few minutes to write down how you are using your students' L1 during your instruction. Can you think of any other ways?
Have to keep. It's interesting to look at how language teaching methodologies have evolved because in the past it was considered important to keep the two languages separate. You don't want interference between English and Swedish or English and French, say in the Canadian context. And the first language is almost seen as the enemy. And that's changed in the last 10 years or so. There's a strong movement towards bringing the languages together in a productive way, in a positive way. The term translanguaging is one that's been used quite a lot in Sweden. It's used internationally in many contexts also. And that's getting at the idea that we don't have to keep the languages separate. In fact, it's not productive to do that. If we bring the languages together and accept students' languages and accept the fact that the languages can feed off each other, there'll be positive results. If you look at languages like English and Swedish, there's all kinds of cognates, languages that have the same roots or are similar across the two languages. And it makes sense to draw students' attention to that, build up their awareness of how the language works. It also makes sense to have students looking at how the two languages connect. And again, the term translation or use of translation got a really bad reputation in the second language learning community, for the last 50 years, because a lot of language teaching 30 years ago, 40 years ago, adopted what was called the grammar translation method, where the grammar was taught out of context and then we would translate across languages. And that was boring for students. That was not particularly exciting. I think many of us have experienced that in a lot of contexts. I certainly did with Latin and classical Greek when I was growing up. But translation can actually be very, very powerful if it's used in the context of something that students are committed to. So one of the really inspirational initiatives across Canada and in some other countries is enabling students from immigrant backgrounds or students in French, English, bilingual programs to create dual language books or bilingual books where they might write the book in one language and then translate it into the other, sometimes with the help of parents, sometimes with the help of teachers. And this causes the students to look at how the two languages are connected, how you might say something in one way in your home language, but English is different. You've got to use a different structure to get across the meaning. And it causes students to talk about language, to become aware of how language works. And so this kind of process of bringing the languages together, whether we use the term translanguaging or whether we talk about bilingual instructional strategies and multilingual instructional strategies, we're looking at a change that hasn't spread very widely within the schools so far, but it's beginning. And there's really exciting practice happening in second language teaching and multilingual teaching by acknowledging all of the language repertoires that students have and bringing that into play in terms of acquiring additional languages.
Again, we encourage you to pause this presentation and take a few minutes to write down how you're using your students' home language during your instruction, or even to spark up a conversation with a colleague about how they may be doing that. So what can you do instead of translating lengthy documents, which to be honest is not best practice, or lengthy pieces of literature? How about if you start by bridging the students' languages? So what do we mean by that? By saying this, we want you to maximize comprehension and scaffold content and language within the context of the content. Also, it will help you build a sense of community, as it will show your students that all languages are valued equally, and these may be used to enhance learning. Bridging a language might sound similar to polylanguaging, translanguaging, multilanguaging, hybrid language practices, flexible bilingualism, just to name a few, which are terms that have been defined in various ways by research. The intention behind these and bridging languages is to give the students a learning environment that allows them to flexibly use all of their languages at different times and for different purposes. But how do you do this? So bridging languages is something that happens fluidly and is beneficial for the student when it is properly planned for. By carefully planning to use the student's home language abilities for all four modalities, listening, reading, writing, and speaking, you can bridge students' languages by including all of the language abilities your students bring with them, again, being intentional and being strategic in how you're using it, and by allowing students to use all of their language abilities to address the different components of the lesson. So again, going back to enhancing the students' metalinguistic awareness and making that connection and bridging those gaps. In order to make this happen, however, you need to be able to provide students with the opportunity to use all their languages prior to, during, and after a lesson. Again, be strategic and be intentional. By creating opportunities for learning that go beyond content language. So think about how you can use songs, poems, readings, or listening to texts on subjects like food and art. Teachers can use this as an opportunity to include additional content and language development in lessons. For example, you can use works of art and then ask the students to create their own, which they can share with their classmates or with students from different classes in their home language. You can support students as they engage with and comprehend complex content and texts. Before you present a topic, ask the students to research about it in their home language and take notes or key points in English. You can provide opportunities for students to develop linguistic practices for academic contents. For example, you can encourage them to read diverse texts in English and in their home language. You can introduce sentence frames for students to use when talking, answering questions, and when summarizing. Also a strong tool in order to promote some discourse. You can help students translate from academic to social language and back. And you can have students use diagrams such as one for similarities and differences. In addition, you want to be able to teach keywords for understanding key prompts. So how are you intentionally using vocabulary or cognates in order to give students access to learning? And using languages to build bilingual students' socio-emotional development and bilingual identities. We want to make sure we are creating classrooms and spaces that are inclusive and welcoming and promote safety and learning for our students. On the following slides, we'll provide you with some specific examples that will help you bridge languages in your classroom. You can use various L1 resources to help in understanding the L2. You can create a daily word study. You can group students with the same L1 for collaborative work, and this allows them to receive a full and deep understanding of the assignment before they share out. You can encourage students to orally use their L1 and L2 to fully express themselves, and you can use L2 after L1 explanation has failed. Also, some other things you can do are label objects in your classroom in multiple languages. By labeling objects in multiple languages, it allows bilingual students to make connections between their native language and the one they're learning. You want to ensure that you're color coding the languages. However, you want to ensure that the font size is equal in size. You don't want English to be larger than, let's say, Spanish or Arabic. We want students to see both languages as equal. And doing that means that when we label things in different languages or side by side, we're color coding them and the languages are the exact same size. You want to give students of all language abilities their time to shine. So we don't want to shame a child for not knowing vocabulary in a second language, especially if they're just in the process of learning it. This can be discouraging, and it can discourage them from learning negatively and affect their self-confidence. Instead, give all students a moment to share their knowledge. For example, throughout your lesson on fruits and vegetables, ask a native English speaker to partner with an ELL student to name all of the fruits and vegetables in both languages. By emphasizing both languages in a positive light, it allows all children to learn new vocabulary and creates an encouraging learning environment that fosters all students, regardless of their native language. In addition, you might want to consider stocking your learning space with age-appropriate books and multimedia resources in the languages of your students. By having books and digital resources in multiple languages, it allows students the opportunity to build upon their home language and learn a second or even a third language. If possible, use bilingual books and digital content that shows two languages side by side to help students make the connection between their L1 and L2. For teens, something like graphic novels can also lend itself to comparing the two languages and getting a visual in addition to the translations. When grouping students for collaborative work, you can allow students with the same home language to work together, and this allows them to receive a deep understanding of the assignment. You can allow them to engage with each other in their home language and discuss a text prior to having to translate it into English. You can learn key words in your students' home language. So be a co-learner. You can learn from your students about their language and their cultural practices. It also provides a space of inclusivity and safety. If students see that you're being intentional about learning short phrases or how to greet or say goodbye in their home language, it demonstrates to them that you do care and that you are interested, not only in them as a learner, but them as a student. Remember that there's some shifts you need to implement during instruction to help you when you're bridging languages. So you want to consider, how are you creating a culturally responsive, sustaining learning space? Like we just mentioned, are you being intentional about possibly learning some things about your students' culture or learning some words in their first language? You can be intentional and specific in delivering the message to students that all languages are welcome in your classroom. And this can be done by you modeling his or her participation as a language learner by asking the student how things are said, even making mistakes, showing the student that you are also making mistakes in learning a new language. It's a natural process of language learning. You can ensure there's a message of language equity in the learning space. That is, you're not highlighting the importance of one language over the other. When students feel that their language and culture is welcome in the learning space and is being empowered to utilize it, it creates a safe environment for the student. Finally, you want to model dialects of words used in different countries to validate students' backgrounds and support and culturally responsive and sustained practices. Okay, so now that you have a good understanding of how to bridge language before you translate, we're going to focus on the second strategy, which is using the home language as a scaffold for English content area classes and ENL classes. So why do we want you to use the home language as a scaffold? Research on language acquisition shows it to be beneficial for a student to use their L1. A student's home language, or L1, should be used as an effective scaffold in supporting students in learning content and acquiring a target language. Again, being strategic rather than reverting to just translating everything for the student. So as you can see, using the home language as a resource is key in supporting the academic and linguistic growth of our students. Now we're going to hear a little bit from Dr. Nancy Cloud, who's going to talk to us about why we need to use our students' home language for instruction. Again, intentional and strategic. So let's take a listen.
Sometimes teachers say, well, they're here now, so why should I pay any attention to their primary language? I don't speak their primary language. Why should I even consider that? They need to learn English. I need to get them into English. But we know that the native language, and this is well borne out by the research, that the native language holds an unbelievable power on successful English learning and literacy in English. And where students have considerable primary language developed and primary literacy, if we can measure that coming in, we can predict who's going to jump into English quickly and who might take a little more time to get into English and through English. So when learners come and they have a lot of primary language, they have skills built in their primary language. They have strategies in their primary language. They're active readers. They know what reading and writing are. And in many cases in the US and in North America and many other parts of the world, the language that they know as their primary language shares an alphabet with English. So they're bringing a tremendous amount, to say nothing of vocabulary, the cognates that exist between their primary language and English. So to turn that off and say, click, we're not going to use that, it is actually, you can't turn it off. The student is going to bring it anyway, just as we would bring English into any language that we're going to learn. It's a known skill set. We're going to try to use it if we can to jump into the other language. So it's a bridge, it's a tool. I can build a lot of background knowledge through the primary language, and it's a confidence booster. If I know that I can read and write in my primary language, I'm going to be fearless going into English. But if I'm weak in my primary language, I could be insecure going into English. And then the teacher needs to know that and understand that they're going to need to give me more support because I never had the chance to really develop my mother tongue before jumping into English. But it's always important with an English language learner, and it doesn't matter high incidence, low incidence. If I could know something about their primary language when they come into my classroom, it would be so useful to me. And I do want to mention the two tools here. One is omniglot.com, which allows you to look at the orthography of all the languages of the world so that you can see what the symbol system looks like and learn, is it a syllabic language? Is it an alphabetic language? Even if they've only been exposed to it in the environment and they have never been taught actively to read, it's still important. Those are the symbols they saw in the world. And another one is Words Their Way with English language learners, which teaches me about how to bridge from the primary language over to English. So these are not the only tools, but these are some critical tools that can really help us when working with a second language reader to learn ourselves. We have an obligation as teachers to know our learners and to know our learners' language and to educate ourselves. And it's fun. It's fun to learn about their language, and we make better guesses about why they're doing things. When we're trying to teach them to read and write, all of a sudden their behavior starts to make sense to us because we've taken the time to come to know something about their primary language.
In addition to using the home language for instruction, this has shown that in educational programs that systematically incorporate an English language learner's first language results in levels of academic success which are often as high or even higher than that of ELLs in English-only programs. So what are you waiting for? You're probably asking, when do I use my student's home language? Well, you should view the home language as a communication tool that, like any other tool, can be used judiciously to support an ELLs or MLs learning. You need to be strategic and decide when it is appropriate to provide resources and allow students to use their home language, or when it is not appropriate. In making a decision about when it is appropriate to invite and support students' use of their home language, there's two questions that you should take careful consideration into, which are, can a task be completed more efficiently through the home language than the target language? Will learning a target language and content matter be better supported by using the L1 with the L2 for any given task? How am I giving students access to learning using their L1 without fully just translating my entire lesson? Please be mindful that the purpose of using the home language is not to replace one language with the other. That is not the message we want to send. Rather, it is to promote students' abilities to use both or more languages to support and deepen understandings of subject matters, to strengthen the student's academic interactions with his or her peers in and out of the learning environment, and to develop their linguistic abilities themselves in the process. This integration of the home language thereby invites and encourages bilinguals to apply all their linguistic resources to communicate effectively and in order to also access their learning. Now we're going to hear from two teachers. Both are going to share their perspective and experiences about using the home language for instruction. Take careful note in how they strategically plan to use the student's home language in order to further understand the individual student and how they can give them access to learning. Let's take a look.
Currently, we're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, which is one of my favorite books, and I think it's a great book to teach this population of students. And one of my favorite quotes from this book is, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb in his skin and walk around in it. I think that's what it's all about. I think as a middle school teacher, it's all about empathy.
Welcome back to Teaching Bilinguals, even if you're not one. I'm Sarah Vogel, a research assistant with the CUNY New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals. Today, I'm here at Ebbets Field Middle School, an exceptionally diverse school in Brooklyn, New York. On any given day, you can hear students speaking Haitian Creole, English, Spanish, Arabic, and 2 dialects of Fulani. Miss Shireen Chapman-Santiago is an 8th grade English teacher here, and she truly lives by that philosophy from To Kill a Mockingbird, that you have to know students well in order to teach them. But how can you truly crawl into your student's skin if you don't share their language practices? In this episode, we're going to find out how she does it.
I think the quote really inspires me to dive deep and understand who the student is, and not just, a name on a roster, but who is that person, and build a relationship.
Let's get into Miss Chapman-Santiago's tips for building relationships with her bilingual students. Tip 1. Miss Chapman-Santiago is a keen observer of her students' expressions and behavior.
First and foremost, cues, body language. When you give them something and they're just like, they delve into it, or they kind of just like look around. So I always look at those things. Like I'm a mother first, right? So I'm very in tune to their emotions because they are teenagers and they're very dramatic. And so when they come in with that face, I'm not going to continue with the lesson. I'll direct the students to do something and I'll pull them out in the hall and have a conversation. If we don't speak the same language, I'll pull out my phone, I'll type the question, give it to them, they'll respond. And I've literally had conversations like that and uncovered some really deep and personal things that actually helped me deal with the students accordingly.
Tip 2. When it comes to academics, Ms. Chapman-Santiago provides opportunities for students to show what they know using home language practices. That way, she can see their strengths and their challenges.
The starting points vary from child to child. So even if you have 3 kids from Yemen, one may have had like some very advanced education, some may not because they're from the rural part. Those that are more proficient have an easier time making the transition from their language to English, while those maybe with formerly interrupted education may need more interventions. I don't know the languages of the room, but I look at the work and I can infer where they are and modify accordingly. If I gave her the prompt in Arabic and she only wrote 2 lines, and I started wondering, is she proficient in Arabic? And then I'll compare it to her counterpart who'll have a full page. And then I'm like, maybe I'll need to give her a little sentence starter or a little bit more background. In the beginning of the year, January, she started out with just 2 lines.
And then what do we see kind of later in the year with your supports?
So she's writing more in Arabic, but it's half a page now. And then she's now attempting to write in English. And even though it's 2 lines, it's a victory for me. But today's entry was awesome. Where is it? It says, I wear my hijab. I don't know what that says. With my Islamic clothes, which makes me glamorous. And I was like, yes, you are glamorous.
Tip 3. Based on her observations, Ms. Chapman-Santiago creates scaffolds that draw on students' home language practices. Students who are literate in home languages benefit from translated copies of texts and prompts, like this exit slip. While students complete this assignment, they can talk to a partner using whatever language they'd like to ensure they understand what's being asked of them. In the end, they must answer the question in English so Ms. Chapman can see how they progress on specific language objectives.
You know, Google Translate is always open, and then where I can, I have students also help. And I'll send things home to like older sisters or mom, you know, parents for feedback, and it's just right. But it is a challenge. I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot of work, but it's necessary if you want everybody to succeed.
To recap, Ms. Chapman Santiago uses clues beyond language to help her understand her students. She makes careful inferences from students' home language practices, even if she doesn't always understand what they say or write. Ms. Chapman Santiago welcomes all kinds of language expression in her class and provides resources in home languages to students who she knows will benefit from them. Ms. Chapman Santiago demonstrates you can teach bilinguals even if you're not one. Join us next time.
So Ms. Chapman made a great point about empathy and walking around in your student's skin. So how are you being empathetic in your lesson planning, or how are you being empathetic in the delivery of your instruction? The next video is about multilingual classrooms, the new reality of urban schools. Let's take a look.
Before we think about whether it's a problem or an opportunity, it's simply the reality of many of our urban classrooms. And what we really should be asking ourselves is whether our education system is adapting itself to the reality in front of it. So it can be an opportunity when the teachers and the schools feel positive about these pupils in their schools, and whether they're confident and knowledgeable about how to approach multilingualism. But it can also be a problem when teachers are not equipped to deal with these children. So they need resources, they need time, they need training, they need pedagogical strategies. This is an interesting question because school is the first major social place that a child has to integrate into. Research indicates that the use of home languages in the classroom actually helps children to make better progress and contributes to feelings of well-being in school. And it helps children to engage with the curriculum in a more meaningful way and to be positioned as competent learners. When we allow children to use their home languages in the classroom, it allows them to become confident, to have positive participation, and it means they can be valued for who they are now rather than who they will become when they have learned the language of instruction. And of course, learning the language of school is important, but this goes hand in hand with integration. And it's important to remember that the school language is not the only way that children build their social world and integrate. When we look at what's happening in classrooms and playgrounds, the reality is that children are engaging with multiple languages every day and including and building bridges. So things like language brokering, jokes, translation, and games. And these are not only happening in one language. So we don't have to have a paradigm of just a majority or a minority language. We can include both. And if we forbid home languages, we make it so much more difficult for a newly arrived migrant child to participate meaningfully in the school community. And language learning is much more likely to occur when a child feels integrated and appreciated and as a meaningful member of the school community. Functional multilingual learning is an approach we've been developing at the University of Ghent. What this is trying to do is to move away from the binaries of monolingual submersion education, which is what is happening a lot at the moment, and bilingual education, where children are able to become literate in 2 languages. So in our very linguistically diverse urban classrooms, where we sometimes have 10 languages in a classroom, this just isn't possible to make sure that all children can learn to read and write in both languages. So functional multilingual learning sits somewhere on the spectrum between the two of these 2 positions. So there are 3 main pillars to functional multilingual learning. The first one is the creation of a safe classroom environment where the children feel happy and welcome. The second pillar is the possibility for children to interact in other languages, maybe between each other, maybe with other members of staff in the school. And the third pillar is the creation of meaningful multilingual activities to achieve a real life goal. So in terms of the benefits, really what this approach does is it takes the language reality as its start point, and it enables children to draw from a wider range of learning resources. And we see a lot of evidence for children helping each other, working together, using other languages to construct understanding and to help them with the learning processes in the classroom. And in general, this increases well-being in the classroom because it values the children's home knowledge and includes them in classroom practice every day.
So to encourage students to see connections between their languages and thus to better understand how languages are structured and organized, talk to your ELLs and ML students about their home language. Show interest and ask them questions. To consider how the home language is the same and how it is different from the target language, you can ask them to make those connections or identify similarities and differences. You can ask them to see if there are words in the home language that sound the same and mean the same in both the L1 and the L2. You can ask them if there's words in the home language and the target language that sound and look the same but mean different things. In addition, as part of phonological and metalinguistic awareness exercises, it's to facilitate reading acquisition. You can ask the students to say words that start with the same sounds in the target language or in the home language. How are words changed and formed in the L1? Singular and plurals, how are those formed? Present and past tense of verbs, how are those formed? Having them really critique and be analysts of language in order to enhance their word knowledge. You can ask them who are new to your class, who can you read a book to in your home language? Who can you show what you've learned about reading? To make this transition of using the student's home language, a shift needs to really occur. And therefore, as the educator, you're going to need a few things. You're going to need to recognize the value of using the home language and the target language for different purposes. You're going to need to know that ELLs and MLs use their home language and the target language at different times. During small group discussion could be one, during conferencing could be another, or to simply make meaning of what they're learning. You need to also know the use of the home language and target language based on cultural practices and perspectives. This can also influence the student's learning. And strategically implement the use of home language and the target language during instructional practices. So as you can see, there's a common theme about the intentionality and how strategic you are in combining a student's L1 and their L2 as they're learning to develop it. Now we're moving to our third strategy of using cognates. So what are cognates? Well, cognates are words that in two languages share similar meaning, spelling, and pronunciation. For many ELLs and MLs, cognates are an obvious bridge to the English language. While English may share very few cognates with a language like Chinese, 30 to 40% of all words in English have a related word in Spanish. And the same could be true for other Romance languages. So cognates can be used during the introduction of a lesson to give your content and language objectives. You can review the instructions or directions, or like I said, your content and language objectives. They can be used or pointed out during read alouds and guided reading groups to help students make meaning. So something you may want to consider is doing a preview walk of the book, picture walk for the little guys. For the older guys, you can just do a walk of the book and see if there's any words that can possibly be cognates. During writing activities, students can have a reference chart with cognates on which they've helped to create. During peer engagement activities, i.e. you can do a scavenger hunt, or you can have students look for other things around the room or in the learning space. And simply during conversations or modeling for them, well, what does that sound like in Spanish? Or what does that word in Spanish sound like in English? How are cognates used during instruction? So like I mentioned, there's a few ways. You can do a read aloud. So when you do a read aloud to your students, ask the home language speakers to raise their hand when they think they hear a cognate. Stop reading and discuss that cognate together. For example, if you point out that subtle differences you hear between the Spanish and the English words, if you have a French, Italian, or Portuguese speaker in your class, invite them to contribute to the cognates in their language as well. Another thing is student reading. So you can identify or look for cognates in student reading, have all ELLs read their texts, and ask them to find 3 or 4 cognates and write them on sticky pads. You can collect those notes and put them on our cognates wall or a laminated chart for them to reference. Before the class ends, you can read or have students read them to the class. And discuss spellings or sounds that are the same and different between the cognates, but always leaving the words up so that students can have a reference when needed. You can do word sorts, pair students and give them each pair of set of cognate cards. One card has the English cognate and the other has the home language cognate. For example, you can have the students sort the words, then ask them what the word and pairs have in common and write a response on the board. Or you can even have them be creative and use the words in a sentence, perhaps a bilingual sentence. You can have students circle differences. Ask them to indicate which letters are different between the cognates and circling the letters. For vocabulary introduction, you can present the vocabulary after you've done your content and language objective and ask students if the word has a cognate. Does it have the same meaning, or is it a false cognate? Which they do exist. So you want to be clear and intentional in teaching the students about false cognates as well. You can present the vocabulary with the cognate in a different color. On the next slide, we're going to look at what false cognates are. So, what are false cognates? I was so embarrassed. Embarrassed equals embarazada. Huh? I didn't know you were pregnant. Question. Embarrassed in Spanish is avergonzada. Pregnant in Spanish is embarazada. So don't let these false cognates trick you. You want to be specific when speaking to your students about them. Warn them that they might run into some words that are false cognates, and these are words that look and sound very similar, but do not at all have the same meaning in the target language or the home language. So does anyone know what embarrassed meant in English? You feel ashamed of something. Did anybody know what embarazada meant in Spanish? So give students some cognates and false cognates and ask them to identify each and have some fun with them. Tell them they don't have to be embarrassed. Now we're going to watch another quick video. In this interview with Susan LaFawn, an assistant in educational services with New York State United Teachers, she shares strategies and best practices for teaching ELLs while using cognates. So let's take a look.
What's really important about teaching cognates is it helps the students who are learning their second language to make connections to their first language, to see that everything's not in a vacuum, that things are related. Also, cognates help with the study of words. If students do speak a Latin-based language, then you can show the similarities in a variety of different languages, or even the Germanic, based on where we get our vocabulary words from, where we get our words from. Sometimes you'll see Arabic influences, and it's neat to show that for students so they can make that connection. It helps to memorize it. It also helps with fix-up strategies, because as students read, they need to break down the word to figure out what it means. And sometimes recognizing parts of it will help them in understanding what the vocabulary word is. What's real?
Also remember the website that Dr. Nancy Cloud had mentioned about making those connections in language and spelling and symbols, and that was omniglot.com. So let's move right along. Using cognates allows students to make connections to learning and language. In addition, it promotes metacognition and metalinguistic awareness. It can serve as a true bridge for students to connect learning from one language to another. It's also tremendous in helping students to make meaning. Look at the example on the screen and see how one word can be accessible to many students in their language and how it can help them improve their linguistic abilities and understanding. To the right here, you have some resources where you can access lists of cognates and false cognates. So we invite you to download those, take a look, and have them handy in your classroom. What are some shifts that need to be implemented during your instruction? So you want to be able to introduce the concept of cognates and false cognates. You want to build that awareness. If you're not specific in telling the students what a cognate is and what a false cognate is, it'll be difficult for them to make that connection or to be intentional in finding cognates. You want students to use cognates to develop comprehension and the vocabulary development. Again, making those connections between what they know and what they're learning. You want to invite students to contribute cognates they know in their home language. Again, having a cognate wall, a place where students can reference during the year or during the unit, is very helpful. You want to provide students lists with cognates as a reference and encourage them to use them. Whenever possible, embed cognates throughout your lessons and plan when to pause and talk about these. You can highlight cognates on your word walls, your vocabulary lists, or even your instructional dictionaries. Ask students to pay attention to cognates for group and independent tasks. Know that ELLs come to school with knowledge that you can use and you can build on that. Continuing, what are the shifts? So you want to be intentional in highlighting and pointing out cognates to students or engaging students in conversations to discover them. This can be done via modeling, via think alouds, via wondering, during read alouds, and creating a space for cognates to live in the learning space and students to use as a reference. Think alouds or wonderings are a great way to model for a student. Contempla, contempla. That sounds like contemplate. In addition, you as the educator need to open the space for observation and reflection when it comes to cognates so that it is embedded in the makeup of your instruction. What can I do instead? So we're going to move towards our last and final strategy, using translations as a scaffold. Again, as a scaffold. But before we get started, let's review a quick definition of what language translation is. Language translation is the process of converting the written word from one language into another language in a way that is culturally and linguistically appropriate so it can be understood by its intended audience. Here we provide you with some instances in which you can use translations to support the learning of ELLs and MLs. They are at the beginning of your lesson. So when you are presenting your content and language objectives, when you're providing directions, when you're presenting vocabulary with definitions and visuals. Remember, visuals for newcomer students and emergent bilinguals is a key and very basic strategy to help with their comprehension and accessing their learning. When presenting essential questions, so that's what you can do prior to starting your lesson. Again, how can I use the L1 intentionally to give them an idea of what it is we will be learning about and give them the access to the topic. For the middle of the lesson, you can use translation when you're providing prompts for student engagement. That could be in the form of sentence frames or sentence starters, and you could have it translated in both languages side by side. When providing sentence starters for turn and talks. And in addition, when you're checking for understanding. For the end of the lesson, you can do it by completing a quick write in the L1, They can use their L1 as their exit ticket. Perhaps they can use their L1 to share out or share with a student who speaks the L1, and that student can help the newcomer student share out the ideas. Through journal entries that you can encourage students to do bilingually, through Post-it notes, and then lastly on a survey. In addition to everything that we've discussed thus far, before you translate, again, consider the following. Are you using TPR, total physical response? Are you using gestures and pantomiming to help student understand what it is that you're delivering? Are you providing explanations through videos or visuals? If you are just speaking in the target language without any visuals, without anything to aid the students in comprehending, they're not going to understand your message. You can use the same language as a peer, but we need to be careful that we don't make the other child feel like an instant translator. You can use flipped classroom techniques, front-loading information and assignments. For example, the teacher can send home resources or documents in preparation for what she'll be teaching next, allowing the child to build that background. And you can look for cognates to help with explanations and directions. Front-loading information and assignments is a very helpful way to give students access to learning. Even if you just tell them the topic you're going to be learning about and having them perhaps look into it in their L1 at home. The following chart will help you determine how the L1 literacy impacts literacy and the decision to use translations. But first, let's respond to the following question. So some viewers have said, does the student have home language literacy on grade level and background knowledge for the content area? If yes, you can use content glossary and or native language dictionary for content-specific vocab and academic vocabulary. For example, you can use Spanish dictionary or an Urdu dictionary. If no, then for content vocabulary, use ELL strategies. For example, cultural diffusion. So for high incidence vocabulary use, dictionaries, glossaries. Example, they can write down, write, wrote, written. For both instances, the use of translation or dictionaries in the L1 must be targeted based on the background of the student's education and language level. What can I do when I translate? We invite you to review the following resources that provides key information on what to do when you translate. You want to translate key components of the lesson, such as the objectives or goals, the directions and specific tasks, and you may want to say the students may need the dictionary spoken to them in their home language for full understanding and for success, according to Eddington 2017. You can translate vocabulary words on your word wall or vocabulary chart. You can have the students write the vocabulary word in both their home language and target language for deeper understanding. Remember, use visuals, color coding for words in English and in the home language. Don't forget that New York State has the bilingual glossaries for many content areas in many different languages represented in our state. In addition, understand how. Understand how the home language is similar to or different from English. This influence can provide extra support, such as the case of English and Spanish cognates. In addition, know the English proficiency levels and the home language literacy levels for your students. In upper levels, however, students are expected to understand explanations in English. They should not be encouraged to rely on translation, as this will eventually become a habit and they will have less interest in learning the language. And that is from Al-Musawi 2014. So as much as we want to be strategic of the use of translation, we don't want it to become a habit, because the child will then revert to wanting to use only their L1, and it will impact their development and their learning of the L2. You want to plan carefully and recognize the problems associated with traditional approaches to translation. You want to allow students to translate to one another during group or independent work, if possible paired with a student that speaks the same language. But the use of translation as a social strategy, using communication as a powerful tool to learn the new language together, It can work in many ways, which they may collectively support each other in learning a new language. You can also use bilingual textbooks so that even the newest learners can pull concepts directly from the text. You can use translations to teach English vocabulary words, idioms, phrases to check key components of the readings and for listening comprehension. You can discuss the differences and similarities during the translation process as it helps learners understand the interaction of two languages and the problems caused by it. You can support the content you're teaching by offering a variety of books, both fiction and nonfiction, in the languages spoken by students. You can use the New York State glossaries for ELLs and MLLs for their accommodations and for instruction during the school year. These glossaries may be downloaded and printed and disseminated to all educators and parents of ELLs and MLLs. And finally, you can translate the classroom routines, including rules and expectations. So at the younger grades, that may be very helpful. And again, you want to consider visual representations so that students can see at what time what actions will be taken. Like the previous strategies, there are shifts that need to occur in order to use translations for instruction. Please keep in mind the following. Do not translate all documents and text for students. This is not best practice. This is not translanguaging. It's simply translating. Do exhaust all other ELL scaffolds and strategies such as pantomiming, using relia, videos, visuals, definitions, and cognates, as well as multiple examples before you translate. The teacher is not the only source of translation. Allow the students to translate to one another. Make sure students are not dependable on the translations provided by the teacher or by the students. You also don't want to put that pressure on the student who's doing the translation. You want to ensure that any translations you share with students are accurate. None of the translation tools replace learning a language or using a human translator. Provide testing accommodation to ELLs who may take state examinations in mathematics, science, and social studies, either an alternative language edition or in English, whichever is more appropriate to the student's reading skills. The translated versions need to be direct translations of the English assessment, so students identified as ELLs may be permitted to use both assessments simultaneously. What tools as an educator can you use? You might be wondering. Well, we have added here a couple of apps and sites that can help you translate. Please make sure you review these before deciding on which one best fits your needs, and know that none of the translation tools replace learning a language or using a human translator. Please take a couple of minutes to include in the chat the different apps or sites you use and that have been successful to help you translate or communicate with students and their parents. We are not going to go in depth on these home language resources, but we invite you to review these resources to learn more about using the home language in your courses and in your classroom. So we do invite you to pause right here and explore some of the resources that are up on the screen right now. Feel free to have a conversation if you're watching this with a colleague. So our final thought, in addition to thanking you for taking the time to watch this presentation, our final message to you is the use of language our learners bring with them to the school, no matter the level or if you speak their language, is bridging their home language with the target language that you want them to acquire. We want language learners to bring with them all of their language repertoires, and we want them to be able to access it to the best of their ability, however, not reverting to simply translating. So we thank you for your time. We encourage you to share feedback or questions. We will soon be giving you our contact information. And again, we hope that you were able to walk away with some practical strategies to help your English language learners and multilingual learners in your classroom. New York State, we are all teachers of ELLs and MLs, and we hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much from the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages. The authors and contributors to Strengthening L and ML Instruction Workgroup are Ms. Alyssa Canonico, Ms. Andrea Diaz, Ms. Nadia Nashir, Ms. Madeline Sanchez, Ms. Jill Schilling, Ms. Denise Stevenson, and Ms. Priscilla Zarete. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation.